They sent the abandoned Chinese bride to clean his barn as a joke, a cruel wager over whiskey and boredom. But the silent rancher refused to let her go. Her name was May, though no one in the dusty town of Redemption had bothered to ask. They saw only the faded, tattered gray of her traditional Cheong Sam, a silken ghost haunting the sun-baked boardwalk, a remnant of a promise broken by a man who had sailed back to the world he came from without a backward glance. Fletcher, a man whose wealth was as old as his cruelty was new, saw in her a perfect pawn. He and his two shadows, Pete and Billy, had ridden out to the edge of the territory, to the property of a man they called the Granite Hermit, Grant. He was a mountain of a man who spoke in grunts and lived with his cattle, a figure of local legend and fear. Fletcher had made the bet in the saloon the night before, his voice slick with liquor, that he could make the hermit break his silence, that he could force him to acknowledge the town he so clearly despised. The price of the wager was May. They dragged her onto a wagon, her tiny frame lost in the vast, splintered bed, and drove her through a haze of heat and dust to the desolate ranch. Grant emerged from his cabin as they approached, his shadow stretching long and menacing in the afternoon sun. He held a heavy axe, its blade glinting. "What do you want, Fletcher?" His voice was gravel. Fletcher grinned, a flash of white teeth in a sun-browned face. "A gift, Grant, and a proposition. We hear your barn is ripe." Pete and Billy snickered. "Let her clean it. If she finishes it, I'll pay you $100. If she runs before a week is out, you owe me $50. Grant's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, flickered to May. She stood by the wagon, small and still, her face a pale, emotionless mask. He saw the grime on her silk dress, the weariness in her bones. He saw the joke. He looked back at Fletcher, his expression unreadable. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was acceptance, or perhaps dismissal. Fletcher roared with laughter. "Excellent! We'll be back to check on the little sparrow." They shoved May forward, a cruel push between her shoulder blades, and rode away, their laughter swallowed by the immense, oppressive silence of the plains. Grant didn't speak. He simply turned and went back inside his cabin, the door closing with a solid, final thud. May was left alone in the courtyard of her prison, the sun a hammer above, the barn a looming monster of shadow and rot, and the silence a living, breathing thing. May stood for a long time, the dust settling around her worn slippers. The world was a canvas of brown and scorched yellow under a vast, indifferent blue sky. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She turned her gaze to the barn. It was larger than any building she had ever been in, a hulking structure of weathered planks and missing shingles. The stench that rolled out of its gaping maw was a foul mix of old manure, decay, and animal sweat, a smell so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. This was her task. This was the punchline to Fletcher's joke. Inside, the darkness was almost total, broken only by dusty shafts of light piercing through the dilapidated roof. The floor was not a floor at all, but a compacted mountain of filth, years of accumulated waste from cattle and horses, piled almost to the rafters in some places. It was an impossible, Herculean labor. For a moment her body swayed, a wave of despair so profound it threatened to pull her under. She thought of the ship, the endless sea, the promised life that had turned to this. But then, something deep within her, a tiny, hard kernel of defiance that had survived the voyage and the abandonment, asserted itself. They expected her to run. They expected her to weep. They expected her to break. She would do none of those things. Her gaze swept the cavernous space, cataloging, assessing, In a far corner, half buried in straw, she found what she was looking for: a shovel with a splintered handle and a wheelbarrow with a rusted, wobbly wheel. They were broken tools for a broken task. It was fitting. She picked up the shovel. The wood was rough against her soft hands. She took her place at the edge of the great heap of filth. She drove the shovel in. The muck was heavy, dense, and resistant. Her first shovelful was pathetic. She ignored the burning in her shoulders and the protest of her muscles. She dumped the load into the wheelbarrow. Then she did it again, and again. She shoveled, she hauled, she dumped. A rhythm established itself, slow, grueling, and relentless. The sun climbed higher, turning the barn into an oven. Sweat soaked her thin dress, plastering it to her skin. The dust and ammonia stung her eyes and throat. From his window, Grant watched. He saw the small figure in gray, a tireless machine against an immovable object. He had expected tears, a retreat to the shade, a desperate plea. He saw none of it. He saw only the steady rise and fall of the shovel, the slow, painful journey of the squealing wheelbarrow to the far side of the corral, where she emptied it. He watched, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling began to stir in his chest, something that felt dangerously like respect. He turned from the window, his brow furrowed, unsettled by the silent, stubborn ghost in his yard. Days turned into a week. The sun rose and set in a blaze of orange and purple, marking time with brutal heat and chilling starlit nights. May worked from the first light of dawn until the shadows grew too long to see. Her body was a symphony of aches. Her hands, once delicate, were now a mass of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. The tattered gray Cheong Sam was stained and stiff with grime, a second skin of filth. She slept in the empty horse stall she had cleared first, curling up on a bed of clean straw, too exhausted to dream. The mountain of manure was shrinking. It was an almost imperceptible change, a geological shift measured in inches per day, but it was real. A small patch of hard-packed earth was now visible near the great doors. Grant continued his silent vigil. Every morning he would find a tin plate on a stump near the barn. On it would be a piece of jerky and a hard biscuit. Every evening the plate would be empty, wiped clean. He refilled the water barrel by the barn door without a word. He observed her methodical progress, the way she never wasted emotion, the way her small frame seemed to contain an impossible wellspring of endurance. He had lived his life in a fortress of solitude, built from grief and a deep distrust of the world. People were cruel, fickle, and loud. They took and they broke. This woman, this piece of a cruel joke, was different. She was quiet. She was unbreakable. On the 8th day, the heat was at its most ferocious. The air shimmered, and the sky was a white-hot sheet. May felt a dizzying wave wash over her. The edges of her vision blurred to black. The shovel slipped from her grasp, and she crumpled to the ground, a small heap of gray silk in the oppressive dust. She didn't see Grant storm out of his cabin, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He reached her side, his huge frame casting a sudden, welcome shadow over her. He hesitated for only a second before scooping her up. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of bones and fierce will. He carried her not to the cabin, but to the shade of the porch, laying her gently on the cool wooden planks. He went inside and returned with a dipper of cold water from his well. He knelt beside her and held it to her lips. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep, and held no fear, only a profound weariness. She drank, the water a shock of life in her parched throat. He then placed a loaf of freshly baked bread beside her, its scent a foreign, comforting aroma in her world of dust and decay. He said nothing. He simply stood, looked at her for a long moment, then turned and went back inside, leaving her to the bread and the shade and the first true act of kindness she had known in this new, harsh land. The next morning, May was back at work before the sun had fully risen. The bread was gone, and the dipper was placed neatly by the water barrel. When Fletcher and his cronies rode up in a cloud of dust later that afternoon, they found her exactly where they had left her a week before, deep in the barn, her movements steady and sure. The visible progress, however, was galling. A significant portion of the barn floor was now clear, swept clean down to the bare earth. Fletcher's good humor had evaporated. The joke was supposed to be on the hermit and the girl, not on him. "Still at it, little sparrow?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Thought you'd have flown the coop by now." Billy snickered. "Maybe she likes the smell." May did not stop. She did not look up. The rhythmic scrape of her shovel against the floor was the only answer she gave. Her focus was absolute, a silent and potent rejection of their presence. Fletcher's face tightened. Her indifference was more insulting than any retort. He dismounted, intending to goad her further, to get some reaction, any reaction, from the silent woman. Before he could take 2 steps, the cabin door creaked open. Grant emerged and stood on the porch. He didn't speak. He didn't brandish a weapon. He just stood there, arms crossed over his massive chest, his stormy eyes fixed on Fletcher. He was an immovable object, a piece of the landscape as solid and unforgiving as the granite hills behind his property. The air crackled with unspoken threat. Fletcher's bravado faltered under that silent, heavy gaze. The ranch suddenly felt much more isolated, Grant's silence far more menacing than the loudest threat. He looked from the implacable rancher to the indifferent woman and back again. The fun had soured. "Just checking on my investment," he muttered, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. He swung back onto his horse. "Don't get too comfortable," he spat in May's direction, though the threat felt hollow now. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, their retreat hasty and undignified. Grant watched them until they were nothing but a smudge of dust on the horizon. Then his eyes went back to the barn, to the small figure who had not paused in her work. He saw the straightness of her spine, the defiant set of her shoulders. She had faced them down without a word, armed only with her own relentless dignity. For the first time in a very long time, Grant felt something other than the cold emptiness of solitude. He felt a fierce, protective surge, a surprising and unsettling warmth in the frozen landscape of his heart. A new routine settled over the ranch. Each morning, May would find not just jerky and biscuit, but sometimes a piece of fruit or a bowl of warm oatmeal left on the stump. One morning, she emerged from her stall to find the old rusted wheelbarrow gone. In its place was another, the wood clean, the iron fittings free of rust. When she pushed it, the wheel turned smoothly, silently. A few days later, a pair of thick, sturdy leather work gloves appeared beside it. They were far too large for her, but she wore them, the soft leather a welcome shield for her battered hands. These were their conversations, a language of gestures written in objects. The repaired tool was an apology for the impossible task. The gloves were a confession of concern. The extra food was an admission of her humanity. She, in turn, answered him. The empty plates were her acknowledgment. Her continued, tireless work was her promise not to break. The ranch, once a place of silent, hostile isolation, now hummed with a quiet, shared purpose. Grant found himself altering his own schedule. He'd mend fences on the side of the property that overlooked the barn, his hammer blows a steady counterpoint to the scrape of her shovel. He found excuses to be in the yard, checking harnesses, cleaning his tack, all the while keeping a peripheral watch over her. He was a sentinel, a guardian she never acknowledged, but whose presence she felt as surely as the sun on her back. He began to see her not as the abandoned bride, or Fletcher's joke, but simply as May. He saw the intelligence in her eyes when they happened to meet across the dusty expanse, the grace in her economical movements, the incredible resilience that burned like a steady flame within her slight form. He started talking to his horse more, his low rumbling voice carrying on the still air, as if practicing how to fill the silence with something other than menace. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, he watched her finish her work for the day. She stood for a moment, stretching her back, a silhouette against the darkening interior of the nearly finished barn. He felt an urge, powerful and strange, to go to her, to say something. But what? The words were foreign objects in his throat, rusted from disuse. Instead, he turned back to his cabin, banked his fire, and found himself looking around the sparse, lonely room with new eyes. It was clean, orderly, but it was empty. It had been empty for a very long time. For the first time, he found the silence of his home to be not peaceful, but lacking. The change in the weather was sudden and violent. One afternoon, the searing blue sky began to curdle, darkening at the edges to a sickly greenish gray. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on Grant's arms stand on end. A low rumble echoed from the distant hills, a predator's growl. Grant knew the signs. This wasn't a simple summer shower. It was a Texas gully washer, a storm that could tear the roof from a house and turn the hard-packed earth to a sea of mud. He secured the shutters on his cabin and herded his nervous cattle into the sturdiest paddock. His eyes kept darting to the barn, where May was still working, trying to clear the last corner. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that quickly escalated into a high-pitched shriek. It whipped dust and straw into stinging cyclones. The first drops of rain fell, fat and heavy, spattering the ground like pellets. Then the sky opened. Rain came down not in sheets, but in a solid, blinding wall. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that shook the very foundations of the cabin. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene in stark, ghostly white, and in that instant Grant saw May struggling to drag a loose section of fencing away from the barn door, trying to protect her work. Another shape darted past her, a newborn calf, separated from its mother, bawling in terror as it stumbled into the barn for shelter. The wind tore at the barn's old roof. A loud crack echoed even over the roar of the storm as a main support beam splintered. The structure groaned, threatening to collapse. All thought fled Grant's mind, replaced by a single, primal imperative. He didn't care about the barn. He didn't care about the calf. He burst from his cabin, charging into the maelstrom. The wind and rain hit him like a physical blow, but he barely felt it. He reached May just as she was trying to coax the frightened calf deeper inside. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. Her head whipped around, her eyes wide with surprise in the storm-darkened chaos. "Come!" he roared, the single word nearly ripped away by the wind. It was not a request. It was a command, born of pure, unthinking terror for her safety. He pulled her, half dragging her from the groaning structure. She resisted for a second, her eyes on the calf, but his grip was absolute. He hauled her across the muddy yard and into the solid safety of his cabin, slamming the heavy door shut just as another deafening crack echoed from the barn, followed by the sound of splintering wood and collapse. Inside, the roar of the storm was muffled to a dull, constant thunder. The only light came from the dying embers in the hearth, and the occasional brilliant flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, fleeting detail. Rain hammered against the roof and sluiced down the single window pane. The air was thick with the smell of rain, wet earth, and the unspoken tension between them. May stood dripping in the center of the room, her slight frame trembling. Whether from cold or shock, Grant couldn't tell. Her tattered Cheong Sam clung to her like a second skin, and her dark hair was plastered to her face. He was a massive, looming presence in the small space, his own shirt soaked through, his breathing heavy from the run. For a long moment they just stood there, caught in a tableau. This was his sanctuary, the fortress he had built against the world, and she was now inside it. The storm had breached his walls in a way Fletcher and his taunts never could. Wordlessly, Grant moved to the hearth. He threw a few more logs onto the embers, which hissed and then caught, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room. He turned to a wooden chest in the corner and pulled out a thick wool blanket. He walked over to her and, without a word, draped it around her shoulders. His large, calloused fingers brushed her neck for a fraction of a second, a touch that sent a jolt through them both, as surprising and electric as the lightning outside. She pulled the rough wool tighter around herself, her eyes downcast. He retreated to the far side of the room, putting the length of the cabin between them, as if he needed the distance. He sat in his worn wooden chair, a sentinel in the shadows. She sank to the floor by the fire, huddling into the blanket, a small gray bundle in the growing warmth. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the empty, sterile silence of solitude, nor the tense, watchful silence of the yard. It was a shared silence, filled with the sound of the storm, the crackle of the fire, and their two quiet heartbeats. He watched the firelight play on her face, softening her weary features. He saw the strength there, but also the deep vulnerability she kept so carefully hidden. He saw a person, not a project, a woman, not a wager. And in the heart of the raging storm, within the walls of his self-imposed prison, the granite hermit felt the first terrifying crack in his own foundation. Something had been let in, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he would never be able to force it out again. The storm broke with the dawn. It left behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cool, the earth dark and saturated. Puddles like fractured mirrors dotted the yard. The barn was a wreck. A significant portion of the roof had caved in, crushing the section May had yet to clear. The calf, thankfully, was safe, huddled in the protected area she had already finished. The destruction was immense, a cruel undoing of weeks of her relentless labor. Grant surveyed the damage, a muscle working in his jaw. But his primary emotion was not anger at the loss of his barn. It was a profound, lingering relief that she was safe. As he stood there, he heard the sound of approaching horses. Fletcher was back, with Pete and Billy in tow. They reined in, their expressions a mixture of shock at the storm's devastation and smug satisfaction. "Well, well," Fletcher began, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "Looks like God finished the job for her. The bet's off, Grant. The barn's ruined." He swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the mud. "I've come for the girl. The joke's run its course. We're taking her back to town." At that moment, the cabin door opened, and May stepped out onto the porch. She had found a comb somewhere, and her hair was neat. She had wrung out her dress and wore the wool blanket draped like a shawl. She looked tired, but her dignity was a shield. Fletcher's eyes locked onto her. "There you are, Sparrow. Time to go." He took a step toward the porch. Grant moved. He didn't run. He simply placed himself between Fletcher and the cabin, a human wall. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes were chips of ice. "She stays." The words were quiet, a low rumble, but they carried across the yard with absolute finality. Fletcher stopped, blinking. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "What did you say? She doesn't belong to you. It was a wager, a game. The game is over." "It was never a game," Grant said, his voice dropping even lower, taking on the grinding quality of stone on stone. "And she's not yours to take." A flicker of unease crossed Fletcher's face. This wasn't the mute, indifferent hermit he knew. This was something else, something dangerous. Pete and Billy shifted nervously in their saddles. "Now, see here," Fletcher blustered, trying to regain control. "You have no right—" "Get off my land," Grant interrupted. There was no heat in his voice, only a cold, deadly command. He took a single step forward. It was all it took. Fletcher saw the truth in that moment. He saw it in the unyielding set of Grant's shoulders, in the chilling promise of violence in his eyes. He saw that this man, who had silently tolerated their mockery, would tear them apart to protect the woman standing on his porch. The joke had become deadly serious. Humiliation warred with fear on Fletcher's face. Fear won. Without another word, he scrambled back onto his horse. "This isn't over," he spat. But the threat was empty, a child's tantrum. He yanked his reins and spurred his horse, Billy and Pete scrambling to follow, splashing through the mud in a hasty, shameful retreat. Grant stood his ground until they were gone. Then he slowly turned to face May. The world was quiet again, the only sounds the dripping of water and the soft lowing of cattle. In the days that followed, a new kind of work began. Together, they salvaged what they could from the ruined barn. Grant, with his raw strength, cleared the heavy broken beams, while May, with her meticulous patience, sorted usable planks and tools from the wreckage. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. The vast mountain of filth that had been her original task was now buried under splintered wood, but it no longer mattered. The wager was a distant memory, a foolish prelude to this new reality. They didn't speak of Fletcher. They didn't speak of the storm. They communicated through the passing of a hammer, the holding of a ladder, the shared weight of a heavy timber. One afternoon, after they had cleared the last of the debris, May went back to what she had started. She picked up her shovel and began to clear the remaining patch of the barn floor. Grant came and stood beside her. He took the shovel from her hands. She looked up at him, questioning. He simply shook his head and began to work himself, his powerful movements making short work of the task. He was not replacing her. He was joining her. He was finishing the job not because it needed to be done, but because it had been her burden, and he would not let her carry it alone any more. When the last shovelful was tossed onto the pile, the barn floor was finally, completely clear. It was a vast, empty space, smelling of clean earth and damp wood, washed clean by the storm. May stood in the center of it, the place of her humiliation and her triumph. The setting sun streamed through the broken roof, striping the floor with bars of gold. Grant walked over to her. He stopped a few feet away, his large frame silhouetted against the light. His face was in shadow, unreadable. For a moment she thought he would finally send her away. The job was done. The joke was over. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He held it out to her in the palm of his calloused hand. It was a single, dark, iron key. It was old and heavy. She looked from the key to his face, a silent question in her eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the cabin, toward a small, unused room at the back that she had never seen. He wasn't offering her a job. He wasn't offering her charity. He wasn't offering her a cage. He was offering her a door she could close, a space that was hers, a home. Tears welled in her eyes, the first she had shed since arriving in this desolate land. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. Slowly she reached out and took the key. Her small, scarred fingers brushed against his. The key was warm from his hand. She closed her fist around it, the metal cool and solid and real. She looked up at him, and for the first time she gave him a small, hesitant smile. He did not smile back, but something in his stormy eyes softened, like the sky after a long rain. Together they walked out of the empty barn and across the yard to the cabin, their long shadows merging into one in the fading light. Have you ever felt like a joke? Like a piece in someone else's cruel game? Your worth measured only by their capacity for casual cruelty? Have you ever been pushed to the edge of a desolate landscape, handed a broken tool, and told to move an impossible mountain, while the world waited for you to break? Perhaps your mountain isn't a barn filled with filth. Perhaps it's a soul-crushing job, a toxic relationship, or the heavy weight of other people's expectations. They stand back and they watch, waiting for you to surrender, to run, to prove them right. They expect you to shatter under the hammer of the sun. But what if you don't? What if you pick up the broken shovel and just begin? What if you meet their mockery not with words, but with the silent, relentless rhythm of your own survival? Remember the woman in the tattered gray dress? Her strength wasn't in shouting back. It was in the unwavering dignity of her labor and the quiet refusal to become the punchline they wanted her to be. And remember the silent rancher, a man encased in his own lonely fortress. He didn't rescue her with grand words or heroic gestures at first. He was won over by the simple, undeniable power of her resilience. He saw her spirit, and in protecting it, he rediscovered his own. True strength, the kind that remakes the world, often works in silence. It's in the hand that keeps shoveling when every muscle screams. It is in the loaf of bread left on a stump, a quiet admission that you are seen. It's in the shared work after the storm, the unspoken promise that you are no longer alone. It is in the offering of a key, a symbol not of ownership, but of sanctuary and belonging. So I ask you, what mountains are you facing? What cruel jokes are you being asked to endure? Do not let their laughter be the final word. Pick up your shovel. Do the work. Your endurance is a language the entire world can understand, and you never know which silent watchers you might inspire, which closed-off hearts you might teach to open again. Defy the joke. Find your strength in the silence, and build your own home in the wilderness. If this story of quiet defiance and earned belonging moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. There are many more tales of the Unbreakables waiting to be told.